Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today I'm going to give my impressions of the brand new special edition Focal Radiance. Now, this is a closed-back over-ear dynamic driver headphone that comes in right at around $1,300. And in this video, I'm also going to be comparing it to Focal's older dynamic driver closed-back headphone, the Focal Elegia, which is now, I believe, end of life or discontinued. So let's take a look. First of all, both of these headphones bear some resemblance to one another. The Focal Elegia, when it first came out, was around $900, and I think this is now, you can find this on sale or discounted around $500 or $400 in some places. So this is a very good value right now, whereas the Radiance is sort of like the special edition, and they've actually partnered up with Bentley for the design, Bentley Motors, and that's why it's got the Bentley logo on the side here. Just so you guys are aware, this unit was sent to me on loan for evaluation by Focal. I was not paid to say anything one way or another, and I do not get to keep this unit. It goes back to Focal after I'm done with this video or on to the next reviewer. Now, these are similar in that they both use Focal's aluminum magnesium M-shaped dome drivers, but they do have a number of differences in terms of how they sound and also in terms of the comfort. But before getting into the comfort, let's talk about the aesthetics. The Focal Elegia has often been my go-to closed-back office headphone, partially because it's a very classy-looking headphone, and then I think with the Radiance, Focal has actually managed to outdo themselves with the look here. This has to be the coolest looking headphone I've ever seen. You can see this is all black here with a brass trim or copper looking trim, and then the cup is actually made out of, there's leather on the outside of the cup here, and this actually borrows some design inspiration from the Focal Stylia. It's got the leather covered with this sort of pattern. Now the pattern is different from the Stylia, and this one also has more of kind of like a shinier material on it for the pattern across. But I gotta say, I like the look of this better than that of the Stylia. This looks classier, it looks more sleek, it looks more professional, and I'm really into that look. And I also think this looks better than the Elegia, but that's just, of course, my personal taste. And then, of course, you do also have the Bentley logo on the top here as well. For other differences, the pads are now made out of leather, and they're extremely soft. This is the most luxurious and comfortable leather, again, borrowing that similar kind of feeling from the Stylia. And then on the inside, it's kind of got this almost hybrid material with some somewhat perforated sides to it. And then on the bottom, it's actually a slightly different material than the other side of the pad as well. So they're doing some really interesting stuff with the pads here, and this is likely to help with the tuning. But as far as it feels and how comfortable it's going to be, this is more comfortable than the Elegia for sure. And then on the inside of the top here, you also have a slightly different material, and I think this is likely going to last a little bit longer and not get as worn out. And you know, on the Elegia, it's more of a white color or a light gray color, and that can get a little bit discolored over time. And with the black one here, it's not going to have that problem. So overall, the comfort and build and design and aesthetics is all just better on the Radiance, in my opinion. Even though I like it on the Elegia, it's just better on the Radiance. At least for my taste. Maybe you like the look of the Elegia better. For me, it is extremely comfortable. I have no issues wearing this. It's more comfortable than the Elegia to me, and it feels like there isn't quite as much clamp force, but that could also be just because the pads are a little bit more cushiony and they conform a little bit more easily to the side of my head. Additionally, I have an easier time getting a seal as a result of this pad change, and then also it does isolate a little bit better than the Elegia does because it's easier to get that seal. So I think Focal took some of the feedback that they had received from the Elegia and how difficult it is to get a seal there, and how that makes a dramatic impact on bass response, and they've improved it with the Radiance, making it a little bit more versatile in that sense. I do also want to make a quick mention here of the cable and the case. Because this is a collaboration with Bentley Motors, they had to get a case that matched that aesthetic, and so you've got that sort of black and copper look here as well. And then for the cable, the Elegia comes with a cable like this. This cable, in fact, all of Focal's cables that are like this, they're rectangular kind of, and so they keep their shape. They're very stiff and they keep their shape. And so, you know, that's generally the first thing I recommend you do if you buy a Focal headphone, is replace the cable. But with the Radiance, you might not have to, because this is the cable for the Radiance. So instead of getting that, you know, rectangular style, this is just more of a standard kind of, round cable. It's still a little too short for my purposes, and I actually did end up needing to switch to the cable that came with the clear because it's a longer one. But I think this is a big improvement because it doesn't retain its shape quite as much. Now it still does a little bit, so it's not perfect, but it's definitely better than the Elegia cable. Now let's talk about how this sounds. And for anybody wondering, I will have, by the time you're watching this at least, I will have posted the measurements of this on the Gross standardized measurement rig up on the Headphone community forum. I'll leave a link to that in the description. But at the moment, I'm just going to give my description of how I hear this. When it comes to technical performance, so detail, retrieval, and all that stuff, I find it to be quite similar to that of the Elegia, if not slightly cleaner. And let me describe that a little bit. So for detail retrieval, this is the primary area where I hear it to be a little bit better than that of the Elegia, keeping in mind, of course, that they do have a slightly different tonal balance going on as well. But I would put this somewhere in between the Elegia and the clear. Most specifically, I hear the advantage in detail in the lower mid-range. Then when you get up into the upper mid-range and treble, it ends up being fairly similar to the Elegia. But in the lower mid-range, it does a better job of getting that sort of textural nuance to come through, the image clarity, being able to see the whole picture of the music or the instruments that you're listening to. For dynamics, the Radiance is once again similar to the Elegia and similar to the Clear. It has excellent dynamics. That's sort of what Focal does really well with these aluminum magnesium drivers. But actually, because of the different tuning to the bass on the Radiance, the perception of that slam is enhanced a little bit. For soundstage and imaging, I do find there to be more of a difference between the Elegia and the Radiance. The Elegia I find to be more evenly distributed across the front of the stage and a little bit further out for the center image, where the Radiance I find to be a little bit more towards me for the center image and not as evenly spread out, but the lateral definition on the Radiance I find to be a little bit more noticeable. So I think this is also largely due to the tuning changes. I don't think there's any difference as far as how far away the driver is from your ear. When you even just look at them, they look very similar. So I think the main difference there for soundstage has to do with the tonal balance and frequency response. For frequency response and tonal balance, once again, I'll have that linked in the description, and you guys can check that out. But for the Elegia, I always found that it was a little bit too mid forward there over the bass and the treble. So anywhere from like 250, 300 hertz all the way up to 2 kilohertz, it was a little bit too emphasized there on the Elegia. And then the bass and sub bass wasn't as present, and then the treble area above wasn't as noticeably present either. And then on the Radiance, this actually has quite a bit more bass presence. I do hear a little bit of a bass bump there, not unlike what's going on with the Elysia, but I think for a lot of music, that's actually in a desirable spot. For me, I would have preferred that to be a little lower down, but this does have actually a sub bass elevation as well. So it's probably the bassiest of all of Focal's headphones. And then moving into the upper mid-range around 3 and 4K hertz, because the Elegia's mid-range proper was just so elevated, the upper mid-range on the Elysia was a little bit subdued and withdrawn, and that was enhanced a little bit. That the sense of a withdrawn upper mid-range was enhanced a little bit with this headphone. On the Radiance, because the mids are a little bit more in line, like the regular mid-range between like 300 and 2K hertz, it's a little bit more balanced there. It doesn't come across as disjointed there in the upper mid-range. So your piano tones and things like that, they're not, muted or recessed there quite as significantly on the Radiance. But then where the Elegia I find does a little bit better is actually in the lower treble. So we're talking like, 6K hertz. On the Radiance, I find that it's just a little bit, pulled back and withdrawn for my taste. And then for the rest of the treble after, 8K hertz and above, the Radiance is totally fine. It's not as, airy and crazy, extended as something like the LCD XC, but the balance for the rest of the treble, like mid treble and upper treble, I think is totally fine on the Radiance, just like it is on the Elysia. So to me, comparing the Radiance to the Elysia, the Radiance has a more balanced sound signature overall, but it is also Focal's warmest headphone, at least out of all of their high-end headphones like the Clear and the Utopia and the Elysia, etc. This is definitely the warmest out of all of them that I've heard. And that's largely just due to 5, 6, 7K hertz being quite a bit withdrawn there. And overall, though, the balance for the in smaller frequency ranges is pretty good on this. It's just that the overall balance is a little bit, clockwise tilted there because of that, treble recession. It's a little bit, withdrawn there. Now, the effect of this, it's actually interesting because it's not like it doesn't have pinna gain. You know, it's not like it doesn't have ear-related gain going on here for the frequency response, like you might find with an Odyssey LCD-X or, you know, some headphones that they're just, you know, super withdrawn there. It does actually have gain at, you know, where the ear amplifies those frequencies. It's just that it's shifted a little bit more towards the fundamental tone rather than its resonant harmonic overtones. And this means that the balance is a little bit more tonally rich, a little more tonally focused. And while that can be a good thing on some recordings and in some ways, or maybe you're, you know, particularly treble sensitive, in other ways, this can be a little bit more on the congested side of things. And on some recordings, it definitely comes across that way. So while overall I do like the Radiance better than the Elegia, there are still certain things that the Elegia does better, at least for my taste. I think there are also going to be a lot of people out there who really want this kind of warm, yet still detailed, yet still technically capable kind of sound. I know that that's kind of one of the things that I always looked for, and it led me down the path of, you know, ZMF headphones. But this is, in my mind, the closest that Focal has come to that kind of thing. And you'll have to be the judge, you know, whether or not that's something that you want. Because for me, this is not like a Focal Clear, and I think that's the big takeaway. You know, a lot of people, when they see a brand new Focal headphone coming out at around $1,300, there's a hope that it's going to be a closed back Clear, and that is not this headphone. This is not a closed back Focal Clear. This has a frequency response and tonal balance that's a lot more similar to that of the Focal Stellia, and it retains some of its characteristics from the Focal Elegia. And I think one of the other questions that a lot of people are going to have is, could you in theory just take the Radiance pads and throw it on the Focal Elegia and have it sound like a Focal Radiance? And the answer is emphatically no, that doesn't actually work at all, because when you put these pads on the Elegia, it cuts the bass out completely. Now you can put the Elegia pads on the Radiance and get a different presentation there, and I did try a bunch of the Dakoni pads on here, you know, with the sheepskin solids and the sheepskin perforated ones. And eventually I just found myself going back to the Radiance pads because the overall total balance is just better with the Radiance pads on the Radiance and the Elegia pads on the Elegia, and then EQ to your heart's content. For this headphone for the Radiance, I did EQ this a little bit, and I found it was actually the easiest one to EQ. You just had a peak filter there with a fairly wide Q value right at around 5.5k hertz, and you boost that up by, you know, like 4 or 5 dB, depending on your preference and how much energy you want there. And then this just makes everything sound a little bit more resolving there as a result. The one area where I think the Radiance really does shine over the Elegia is in the bass response in that lower mid-range performance, because I think, I mean, this was something that I discovered when I was switching all the pads around. With the Elegia, much of the tuning there is done with the pads for the bass response. With the Radiance, it's not. With the Radiance, if you throw other pads on here, the bass response doesn't go away. So they've done something with the implementation of this transducer, of the driver here, to make it so that the bass response isn't strictly, you know, based on pad tuning. The bass response here stays quite a bit more elevated than that of the Elegia, regardless of the pads that you throw on. The best way to frame this would probably be to think of it more as kind of like a special edition Elegia that's been slightly retuned with a fancy new exterior aesthetic. If that speaks to you, then it's worth taking a look and considering this. But I really think that should, you know, all the rest of these factors like the aesthetic and the uniqueness factor and, you know, the Bentley collaboration, you know, I think that needs to factor into your purchase decision too, you know, beyond just the sonic merits of both of these headphones, because the price gap at the moment, while the Elegia is still available, is quite extreme. Anyways, that does it for my first impressions of the Focal Radiance. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next